evening, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are about to welcome the platform party, so if you will all please rise.
You may take your seats.
I'm glad you had me without the microphone and said, what a pleasure is it tonight to be gathered to honor this moment. Welcome, colleagues, students, and friends. I am Professor Erani Ramgondo, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs, and Social Responsiveness at the University of Cape Town. It is my immense pleasure to welcome you all to this UCT inaugural lecture featuring Professor Floretta Boonzaier. She is professor in the Department of Psychology and co-director of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Explorations in Africa. I convey the good wishes and congratulations from our Vice Chancellor, Professor Musa Mushabeni. He regrets very much that he could not join us this evening as he has a conflicting engagement. I'm also very pleased to welcome Professor Boonzaier's family. Prof Floretta's dad is here, Mr. Robin Boonzaier. It's a very proud moment. It really is. Floretta's husband, Sean Daniels. Of course, the twins, Liam and Luke. And many aunts, nephews, nieces. And I believe there are also high school friends who are here. And this speaks volume to the kind of professor we're celebrating today. It's one thing to be professor at UCT, but if your own people don't see a professor in you, we've got to talk. We welcome also those who are joining us online. But also allow me to introduce the platform party for this evening, starting with Professor Shosekesi, the Dean of the Faculty. She will introduce Professor Boonzaier. We also have Professor Tamara Schiffer. She is Senior Professor in Women's and Gender Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of the Western Cape. She will offer the vote of thanks. So inaugural lectures are a special event in the life of a university. They mark the ascent to full professorship, the highest rank and one aspired to by most scholars. Appointment or promotion to this rank constitutes recognition of the stature of the individual and of the high quality and impact of the academic work. It's so nice that the young ones are here too. The journey to professor is not without its own challenges. There are often setbacks with demands that sometimes seem impossible to meet, especially for a research-intensive university such as ours, where on one hand, we want to see academic success for our undergraduate students, and on the other, want to be counted among the best in research and graduate studies, competing with universities abroad who only have to concern themselves with the latter. The criteria for making it to professorship reflect this dual mandate, but also administration, management, and leadership at the highest level, as well as a deep commitment to social responsiveness or social accountability. To tick all the necessary boxes makes attaining the mark of full professor all the more prized. Inaugural lectures provide an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of the lecturer. They also importantly provide an opportunity for the inaugural lecturer to share insights into his, her, or their scholarly work in a manner that is accessible to a broad audience, to tell us something of what they profess. So you get a glimpse tonight of what Floretta's students are exposed to. By increasing our understanding of Professor Boonzaier's work in feminist, critical, qualitative, and decolonial psychologies and her focus on gendered and sexual violence, we also build our understanding of how this rampant crime affects our view of ourselves and our society, not just in South Africa, but everywhere in the world. Last November, the Pan-African Survey Research Network, Afrobarometer, reported that South Africans see gender-based violence as the most important women's rights issue that the government and society must address. The survey found that nearly half of citizens say violence against women and girls is a somewhat common or very common occurrence in their community. So we've normalized gender-based violence. Close to 8 in 10 South Africans say it is never justified for a man to use physical force to discipline his wife. More than 4 in 10 respondents consider it somewhat likely or very likely that a woman will be criticized, harassed, or shamed if she reports GBV to the authorities. But 76% believe that the police are very likely or somewhat likely to take cases of GBV seriously, and that is concerning. Should be 100%. Almost 8 in 10 South Africans say domestic violence should be treated as a criminal matter, while 18% see it as a private matter to be resolved within the family. And we know what that means, the collusion and the complicity. Professor Boonzaier's work helps us to explore critical questions around GBV and our responses to it. And I'm sure we can't wait for exactly that. But before that, we'll have Professor Casey come forward to introduce her.
Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Lelwani Ramugondo, Professor Tamawa Schaefer, the Boonzaier Daniel's family, colleagues and friends. I'm delighted to have the privilege of introducing Professor Floretta Boonzaier this evening, who became Professor of Psychology in 2019, so this inaugural is long overdue. Professor Boonzaier and I have worked together over many years in the Department of Psychology, and we continue to do so. So I want to apologize for the inevitable autobiographical overlaps when speaking about Floretta. It is informed by a deeply personal appreciation of her contribution to our field, with keen insights on my part because of the proximity of our relationship. I feel very fortunate that when I arrived in Cape Town, or at the University of Cape Town 13 years ago, Floretta welcomed me and my family into the institution and into her life, which was fundamental to my adjustment to the university community, as well as Cape Town as a city. Building community is something that we both profoundly value because of our life experiences as Black women in the world, in the academy, but also in what is still a very traditional discipline of psychology. And over time, we have built a community of critical psychologists, locally and internationally, through the work of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Explorations in Africa, located in the Department of Psychology here at UCT. Speaking of the Hub, one of our recent PhD graduates on social media commented that, and I'm quoting, "The Hub space shielded me from the violence Black scholars often experience in academic institutions. It was also in the Hub space where I had all of my learning/unlearning through critical dialogues, lectures, conversations, thinking with, listening to guests, sitting with tension, discomfort, engaged in debates, laughed, cried, and was held." She goes on to say that my research journey in itself was different from most Black scholars due to the work of the Hub space. What is clear from these testimonies is that Professor Boonzaier embodies the decolonial African feminist principles of her work in all of her engagements with colleagues, with students, and as we will no doubt hear this evening, with the participants and collaborators in her research work. And she continues to do this after so many years of selfless service. Professor Boonzaier is a remarkable mentor and has successfully graduated numerous master's and PhD students, most with distinctions. She is highly sought after that even postdocs and international students come to UCT for Floretta. So her role in the department, or in the development, of the next generation of scholars in her field has a massive reach. This has been recognized nationally by the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, where she's taking the role of regional mentor, and internally by the Next Generation Professoriate Program at UCT, where she has been appointed as a mentor and part of the leadership team. Her leadership in the field of psychology is widely acknowledged by her peers. As far back as 2010, Professor Boonzaier was nationally recognized by the Department of Science and Technology in the category of Distinguished Young Women Scientists in the Social Sciences and Humanities, and more recently in the Distinguished Women Scientist category. She is past president of the Psychological Association of South Africa. Her leadership is distinguished by her focus on critical, innovative, ethical practice for psychology. Her national leadership is evidenced by her serving in numerous editorial boards for key journals in her field, putting Professor Boonzaier in a leading role in knowledge production. She has also published in local and international publications with over 100 peer-reviewed manuscripts, also contributing to fields beyond psychology, such as criminology and sociology. DVC Ramungondo, I am proud to say that Professor Boonzaier's contribution to her field has been recognized in her service to curb the scourge of gender-based violence against women and girls in the region. At the peak of the COVID-19 lockdowns in South Africa, President Ramaphosa declared gender-based violence as the second epidemic. He has since gone on to sign a bill into law to address this scourge. The work of Professor Boonzaier as an expert in the area saw to the production of a report towards this move with an emphasis on decolonial feminist approach to dealing with gender-based violence for the region. As a scholar, to play a role towards changing policy or legislation in one's country and continent is one of the highest honors to measure the impact of our work after years of research. Professor Boonzaier is most definitely the top scholar on gender-based violence in this country, and certainly one of the top in the world. As UCT, we are truly honored to have such a high-impact academic who is internationally recognized as a leading scholar in decolonial feminism and is a recipient of international awards and a well-sought-after speaker in international conferences, constantly flying the UCT flag high. At UCT, she was one of the central figures in the Black Academic Caucus during the Rose Must Fall movement, taking sharp positions for intersectional institutional reform. And while not yet uhuru, as Letambuli says, we are proud of what we have achieved. Many of us as Black scholars at UCT today would not be where we are had it not been for those sacrifices. In the work of fighting for change, there is resistance to change, and at all material times, it is important that we state categorically that when we fight for change at UCT, it is because we actually believe in UCT and that as an institution, we believe it can be better. Professor Boonzaier is an embodiment of what it means for this institution to be better when giving equal opportunities to Black academics and creating knowledge for the future. No. Another one of Floretta's brilliant students posted on social media this week that, and I quote, "The speaker is one of the few scholars whose conduct, generosity, and embodied philosophies have persuaded me to stay in the academy. She's also fantastic at being human." If your work has anything to do with the study of violence in all its manifestation, you may be inspired by how this one person has found hope and healing after 20 years in the academy. Congratulations, Floretta, on your professorship and your 20 years at UCT. But I personally believe that Professor Boonzaier's hope and healing in the academy has much to do with the fact that, and I hope we can be friends after this, that she's the queen of karaoke. Many of us have been subjected to Professor Boonzaier's rendition of Redemption Song over many years. But I think what is so inspiring about this secret talent is how she uses it with students and colleagues to open up spaces for free expression and genuine connection, creating belonging in the academy, especially for those of us who were never meant to be here. Professor Boonzaier, it is a privilege to call you my friend. Thank you for the contributions you have made towards my development and those of many others. We are blessed to have you as an institution. I want to thank Sean, Luke, Liam, and the entire family for sharing you with us over many years. To everyone else in the audience, I am deeply humbled to say that although Floretta is not my sister, she is everything a sister should be. So let us put our hands together to our beloved sister.
and the whole time Shose is speaking, I'm panicking about how to observe protocol. So let me try. GBV Ramagondo, Dean Shose Keki, Professor Tammy Schaefer, friends, family, community, good evening. In the 1960s, my father's family was forcibly removed from Protea village in Kirstenbosch. Today, I stand here as a professor at the University of Cape Town, a stone's throw away from where my family would have been, should have been living. A university that stands virtually unacknowledged on the burial grounds of enslaved persons. Another slice of my own silenced and erased history. Today I want to take the opportunity to be here, to reflect on my journey, and to acknowledge my ancestors as I dedicate this lecture to my mother, Carol Veronica Boonzaier. I also take this opportunity to mark my 20th year as an academic at the University of Cape Town. The question of what it means to profess as a woman and black has an answer of two interwoven stories. The story about my scholarship and the story of me. And when I thought about what story I wanted to tell about my journey at UCT towards professorship, I thought that I might focus only on my scholarship, on my academic journey. But I realized that doing that would be telling an incomplete story. A story that would leave out a large and important part of the narrative of how I came to do the work that I do. How was it that this girl from Mitchell's Plain came to do this work at a place like UCT, where her experiences have vacillated between the extremes of alienation, isolation, and exclusion, to those of love, of joy, of belonging, and of healing. Like many families in our country and on our continent, I came from one in which the word feminism was not used but practiced. I learned my feminism from my mother, who was the strongest and most steadfast woman that I know. I learned my feminism from the many women in my family who held it all together, who displayed massive strength and resilience in the face of state and other forms of violence that inevitably shaped their lives. I learned my feminism from the women in the different Cape Flats communities that I lived in. Heideveld, Mitchell's Plain, holding it all together while their families and their communities were falling apart, ensuring that their families were fed, taking in and feeding others who were destitute, raising and educating others' children when they could not do so themselves. I learned my feminism from observing respected members of these different communities doing work underground to support the struggle against apartheid. This feminism I was learning was also grounded in my own experiences of injustice and inequality, of poverty, of witnessing violence and trauma around me. It was learned from seeing the devastating effects of historical forms of trauma and the many psychological scars that it has left on the people around me. So I identified with a grounded feminism long before I even used the word to describe myself. It wasn't until university going to the University of the Western Cape, and being taught by feminists like Tammy Schaefer, Elaine Salo, and others that I began to see myself as feminist and take ownership of my feminist identity. So I came into academia with a strong, grounded feminist politics, which naturally led me to the work on gender-based violence and femicide. Moving from UWC, a place of comfort where I felt seen, I felt recognized, I came to UCT as an honor student in 1999, into a cohort and a department that reflected almost nothing of me and my experiences. This resulted in many experiences of alienation and invisibility. I soon enough realized that my experiences of alienation, exclusion, and racism would be central to the journey that I would undertake at UCT, to the kind of research that I would do, to the questions I would be interested in, and to the kinds of communities that I would build. One of the early questions that occupied me as I was entering into research on intimate partner violence was the obsession with the question of why women stay in abusive relationships. This question was everywhere. Everything I read seemed to blame women who stayed with abusive partners, locating the question of abuse with them rather than with the men who chose to use violence against them, suggesting that there was something psychologically wrong with abused women. This quote from a paper I read in the British Medical Journal, written by a British psychiatrist, shaped much of the research that I would undertake on gender-based violence. In the work I would do, I chose to explicitly shift the focus away from the question of why women stay, and from the question of what was wrong with them, to ask deeper questions about the context of abusive relationships that women find themselves in. I was interested in how women stay. How do they navigate these relationships in which they also suffer violence from a partner? The research showed that women find multiple ways to resist violence and the gendered expectations of them as women. Women's stories, I found, reflect the contradictory nature of their experiences, where they move between social expectations of them on the one hand, of femininity and other gendered expectations, and their own personal aspirations for independence and for strength, highlighting their resistance. In my doctoral work, I was interested in the kinds of relational narratives told about violence in heterosexual relationships. Basically, I was interested in how do two people in a relationship where the man was violent talk about this relationship? How do their stories differ? Where does it stay the same? How do they talk about the violence and its impact? This work took me in multiple directions and shaped my research for the coming years. I obtained my PhD in December 2005, on the eve of giving birth to twin babies, exactly 1 month after my doctoral graduation. No longer babies. As I engaged more deeply with the question of women's agency and resistance, I turned attention to the telling of stories about violence. How do women tell stories about the violence that they experience, and how does this relate to how they see themselves in the world? In this work, I'm very happy to see my co-author, Samantha, in the audience. In this work, we were interested in focusing on how one asks about experiences of violence in research. At the same time, we were interested in how one asks about violence in the lives of women, where violence from a partner is just one of the many things, one of the many difficulties that they face as women. How do you ask about violence in the lives of poor, Black, and marginalized women? Opening up space for storytelling, we found, allowed women to reveal the complexities of what it means to be poor, Black, and woman, disadvantaged in the social structure, but who also faces violence from an intimate partner. Stories, we argued, are important for the expression of experience and identity. Telling stories about violence they experience allowed women to represent their inner realities, to interpret their pasts, to understand their present, and to envision their futures. Telling stories on their own terms also allowed women the opportunity to reclaim their narratives in ways that challenge dominant ideas of what an abused woman is supposed to be. Women's stories and their experiences speak back to the popular image of the passive and helpless woman. They challenge dominant storylines by telling what I call counter stories. For example, they challenge the major focus on physical violence as the only form of legitimate violence. They point to how they experience psychological forms of abuse as more harmful than physical violence. Women also position themselves as strong and in control of their lives, yet they also show how they are limited by the intersectional forms of oppression that shape their lives, which include gender, race, and class. Collectively, this work was important for showing how, despite the fact that women survivors of violence often experience shame, women also use their stories as a means for resistance and empowerment. Even in the face of economic and other difficulties, they find ways to center a feminist narrative of resistance against men's violence. And they offer us an alternative reading of the popular image of abused women. Of course, any work on these topics would be incomplete if we didn't also focus our attention on men and masculinity. In my PhD, I collected narratives from men about their perpetration of violence against women. I worked closely with organizations offering programs for men to end their violence, and I'm very pleased to see Mosaic really well represented here. And much of the work that I would go on to do in collaboration with organizations, with students and colleagues, in addition to theorizing about men and masculinity, was to inform these interventions in a culturally appropriate way. I articulated a key question that drove this work. How do we study marginalized men's violence in contexts where they dominate and violate women and other non-conforming genders, while at the same time giving recognition to the ways in which they themselves continue to be marginalized and dehumanized by historical and ongoing relations of power. This work shows that when men talk about their violence and when they talk about their lives in general, they talk about how it is shaped by their histories of living through apartheid, of living with poverty and unemployment, of living with violence in their childhoods and around them as adults. In their talk, they veer between, on the one hand, feelings of powerlessness in society, while on the other hand, at the same time, facing up to their roles as perpetrators of violence. The men didn't think that these experiences were necessarily taken into account in the programs that they were participating in. We noted that the lack of cultural and contextual sensitivity in these programs can lead to negative outcomes, such as repeat offenses involving domestic violence, as well as feelings of exclusion amongst marginalized men, the very people that these programs were trying to reach. This work has offered a decolonial feminist theoretical perspective on men and masculinities in the global South. The framing takes account of various factors such as colonialism, neoliberalism, and capitalism, and how it influences men's lives and experiences. It offers a way of moving away from simplistic narratives that portray black men as inherently violent, to a deeper recognition of the ways in which historical and ongoing traumas shape men's experiences, a view not accounted for in Eurocentric theoretical models. So having focused closely on how women and men talk about violence in the face of popular stories about them, they don't necessarily capture the complexity of the experiences. I also turned closer attention to these popular stories. What common stories do we tell ourselves and others about why violence happens. I looked at stories located in academic research on GBV, at media discourse on femicide, and at university communications around sexual violence. And this work offered a few common narratives about violence that circulate in South Africa. One key theme that emerged from this direction of my work included showing up the ways in which the problem of gender-based violence had become racialized. In academic research and in popular stories, GBV had come to be seen as a problem for poor and black people. We could see this in the ways that violence was linked to unemployment and poverty uncritically in the academic work. We could also see in how media reports, effort was made to locate the violence in the townships, over there, not connected to the reader of the newspaper in any way. Around 2016, in the aftermath around 2016, in the aftermath of the Roads Must Fall movement on campus, I received some of the following email and SMS messages from the university in response to the incidents of sexual violence that had occurred around the Rhodes Memorial area. Avoid walking or running alone. Avoid areas where you may be isolated or vulnerable to attack. Please think about your daily route and make arrangements beforehand so that you are walking or running in groups. Kola speaks about the female fear factory, and I was becoming increasingly irritated to see firsthand how it was operating in my inbox. This irritation, yes, research can sometimes stem from irritation, led to the desire to take a closer look at how a university communicates about sexual violence. What wider messages are being communicated when the university writes to its own community about gender-based violence? A victim-blaming narrative emerged from both the university communications we analyzed, as well as from media and other discourse on violence more broadly. We all know how pervasive the victim-blaming narrative is. The idea that women are responsible for their own victimization. The common belief that they are somehow to blame for what happened, through their actions or omissions. In the university communication specifically, we saw how women were held responsible for preventing violation, rather than addressing the actions of perpetrators. Another theme that emerged from this work was that our stories about violence lack attention to the underlying factors that produce it. The popular stories about violence fail to sufficiently address underlying issues of patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, and systemic inequalities that contribute to gender-based violence. Instead, they tend to focus on individual behaviors or circumstances. We found overall that the university's institutional discourse on sexual violence reproduces some of the same discourses we find in public and in media narratives more broadly. And we emphasize the importance of a holistic and informed approach to addressing sexual violence in academic institutions, one that prioritizes accountability, education, and institutional change. So I was beginning to argue that decolonizing our thinking about gender-based violence means that we have to pay attention to the stories told about violence, to see how it is being racialized, how this racializing stems from colonial racial stereotypes around images of Africa and its people as violent and barbaric. We also have to see how narratives of victim blaming continue, but how this is also racialized and classed. This work has important implications for the research we do and the knowledge we produce about gender-based violence. When we make arguments about poverty and unemployment, for example, without taking a critical lens on what that actually means. In February of 2013, my twin sons were 7 years old. A young woman who lived in Bredasdorp in the Southern Cape region was 17 years old. Like every other month, February of that year was a bad month for women. It was the month that both Anine Boysen and Reva Steenkamp were killed. Other women too, but the death of these two women made national and international news. I remember the school run, driving through Mowbray, up Durban Road, seeing and being confronted by the newspaper posters, especially the tabloid newspaper posters, about Anine Boysen's horrible rape and murder. I remember wanting to protect my children from seeing them, or perhaps even asking me questions about them. I remember scrambling to turn off the radio news every time they reported the story of Anine Boysen's murder. This experience of turning down the volume on the radio news on reports of graphic violence would go on for some time on the morning school drive, until a few years later, when one of the boys called me out. "Mom, why do you keep turning down the volume?" Mom is speechless. Boy continues. "We can handle it." Mom is still speechless. I realized then that I was also attempting to shield myself. When the call for a special issue of the South African Journal of Psychology came out a few years later, I realized that I needed to write about the story of Anine Boysen. Her story was sitting inside of me, and it still does. I combed through media reports about the death of Anine Boysen, and I realized that while much had been written about her death, we knew very little about her life. All we really knew was the recollection of her movements on the night of the murder and the very graphic details of how she died. Through this analysis, I showed how the media reporting on the death of Anine Boysen draws on colonial legacies that hyper-visibilize the bodies of black women in the most public ways possible, yet at the same time silencing their identities. I showed how media representations of gendered violence, particularly in the case of Anine Boysen, dehumanize black women, making them less deserving of our empathy. I argued that the ways in which Anine was represented mirrored the colonial story about Sarah Baartman. The decolonial feminist lens I took allowed me to explore how these representations reinforce stereotypes about black femininity, perpetuating a colonial fixation with black women's bodies. However, I also asked about what other stories can be told about the lives of these women who are black, indigenous, and marginalized. What other stories can be told about the lives of women that we only encounter through their deaths? What are the ways of seeing differently? How can we recognize their humanity in the face of everything that dehumanizes them? For me, this work has had much larger implications than that surrounding gender-based violence, relating to the question of how do we recognize people's humanity in our engagements with them, especially for those who have been dehumanized. How do we offer them dignity and acknowledge their humanity and the complexity of their lives and experiences? Having done a close analysis of Anine Boysen's story, I go on to attend to an analysis of media representations of femicide more broadly, showing in greater detail how the media's portrayal of femicide draws on long-standing colonial ideas that continue to racialize femicide and depict black women as hypervisible and black men as invisible perpetrators, normalizing their perpetration. A victim-blaming narrative also still remains through the perpetuation of stereotypes that blame women. Femicide is also made into something spectacular and is often represented in a way that makes it appear devious and monstrous, detached from its social and historical roots. This spectacularization serves to frame the violence as an external evil, reinforcing the idea that it is something that occurs outside the norm of society, rather than a systemic issue that is deeply embedded in social structures. The effect of this spectacle also desensitizes us to the violence. It diminishes the emotional impact of these stories, making it easier for us to overlook the gravity of the issue and the suffering that it entails. Importantly, I show how South African media adopts a Western gaze in its reporting, positioning the country as an outsider looking in on its own monstrous violence. This colonial gaze frames South Africa as barbaric and uncivilized. And this echoes global media representations of Africa as other. It has important implications for how we see ourselves and our violence. In the main, the implications of this work on decolonizing our stories of violence makes the link between everyday understanding and its implications for action. If we see violence as outside of ourselves and our experiences, if we don't make the links between our everyday experiences that reinforce gender norms and how it provides support for violence, then we will make very little inroads into ending violence against women, girls, and gender non-conforming persons. If it's not already evident in what I've said, I'm also articulating the ways in which I led and contribute to building a decolonial feminist and intersectional archive of work in psychology and on gender-based violence and femicide. This has also included other work not mentioned here, such as a report in collaboration with colleagues, including Shose, for the Office of the South African Presidency, around articulating what a decolonial feminist approach to violence against women and girls in Africa should look like. The report is being used towards shaping funding, policy, and other agendas in the sector, both nationally and regionally. Alongside this decolonial feminist work, which has been a labor of resistance, of love, and of building new worlds, my work has also argued for and illustrated the importance of a narrative decolonial feminist approach to research, one that centers storytelling as a means of resistance, of rehumanization, of dignity, and of empowerment, especially for those not considered human. This labor of resistance, love, and building new worlds has been nowhere more apparent than in the work we have been doing in the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa. In 2018, myself and my co-conspirator, friend and comrade, launched the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa, a space that has now exceeded the vision and expectations we had for it at the time. The space is student-led and driven. Our aim for this space, which is both a physical space and an intellectual space, was to create a place of belonging for us as Black and marginalized academics and students in psychology. It is a space in which we theorize about ourselves and our lives from our own histories, locations, and our own lived experiences without apology. A space in which we show up for each other, and in doing so, we also show up for ourselves. We come together academically and socially to support each other in the difficult work we do on violence and trauma. As an intellectual space, we've created a home in which we belong, to ourselves and to each other, in recognition that colonial institutions were not designed for us. A space in which we escape exclusion, feeling unsafe, unseen, and moving towards a new way of experiencing academic institutions. It is about recentering of the marginalized, occupying spaces from which we are often deliberately excluded, and paving new paths so that future generations can walk in as their complete selves. It has involved building a community of decolonial feminist psychologists invested in centering questions of social justice in their work, through practices such as recruiting psychologists, and I'm happy to see Kim in the audience, to support researchers with debriefing after conducting research on difficult topics like gender-based violence, as well as organizing regular community activities like writing retreats and book clubs. The Hub has fostered a safe space where students and researchers can be held, replenished, and encouraged in their academic and activist work. Since 2019, some of us have been engaged in a project housed within the Hub, entitled Unsettling Knowledge Production on Gendered and Sexual Violence. We've worked in this project to collectively disrupt some of the normative assumptions about gender-based violence. We began with the question of why we still see so much gender-based violence, despite decades of activism and research. And we argued that we need to tackle some of the taken for granted assumptions about why violence happens, who is violent, and who is considered its perpetrators and victims. In the metrics that the university system recognizes, this research was successful and paid the dividends for the 5 million rand investment it made. Many students have obtained their honors, masters, and PhD degrees through the project. We presented on our work at different conferences in our discipline and outside of it. And there have been many academic publications that emerged from the project in the 5-year cycle. However, for us, this metric of success was less tangible, less tied to an external reward system, and more to do with our own questions of belonging, of healing, and of recognition. In the penultimate year of the project, which was 2022, we embarked on a process that has remained significant for the work we continue to do. We shifted towards a more deliberate, intentional focus on our own positionalities as researchers who work on violence, asking ourselves some of the following questions. A key issue that drove this direction of the work was that we had to find ways to support and care for ourselves and others as we were doing this work on violence. As a growing community of decolonial feminist scholars, we had to find ways to create safe spaces to engage this difficult topic. And we had to find the freedom to interrogate our preconceived assumptions about what research, teaching, and community building could look like at a university, especially one like the University of Cape Town. We also sat with the question of how we bring our whole selves into the work that we do. We conducted a 3-day retreat to explicitly address these questions, collaboratively and creatively. We used a range of methods that were autoethnographic, self-driven, creative, and collaborative. And they involved interviews, pottery, memory work, drumming, painting, Lego, amongst others. This process of researching ourselves was both illuminating and deeply moving. We felt connected to each other, and we felt held in our vulnerability. The positive impact of this research on this retreat on our community still persists today. The process felt healing, and it was fertile. At least 2 of the students who were doing their masters at the time felt that they were able to continue this work and are currently doing their PhDs in the Hub. We realized that the healing experience of the retreat emerged from the community building that we had been doing through the Hub, and how all of these was shaped by our own experiences of alienation in academia and at UCT specifically. We worked collaboratively to publish a book chapter and a journal article based on this work, but more importantly, we found a sense of purpose, freedom, and meaning in the work. Through this work, we offer ways of thinking about producing knowledge on gender-based violence that is respectful and which contributes to the goals of care, ethical engagement, and social justice, including for ourselves as researchers. As part of this work, we produced a documentary that talks about the space of the Hub, as well as this project, and involves our reflections on what it means to do work on violence and trauma for us as marginalized researchers. Moving from this work, we are now working specifically with questions of healing in and through research. How research can act as a healing modality. We also recognize that our healing is collective. It is tied to healing for each other and for the communities from which we come. To open up conversations about healing in order to move us, We open up conversations about healing in order to move us towards enactments of decolonial hope, of love, and of joy. As I come to the conversation about decolonial hope, love, and joy, I want to return to where I began this lecture, to thinking about what it means to profess while black and woman. Who is this professor that they imagine? What stories about me do they try to impose on me? What stories have I brought with me into academia? And how have I opened up my own spaces to allow for its expression? In this moment that I'm owning as a celebration, it's hard not to stand here and not recall the indignities I had to suffer in order that I might be considered a full professor at UCT. It is hard not to recall the indignities of what it meant to be racialized colored in the apartheid and colonial imaginaries of fellow students when I was a student here. Hard not to recall the snide remarks, forms of surveillance, and covert racism I experienced from colleagues as I worked hard to move up the ranks. Hard not to recall how I was being constrained by other stereotypes about me. Hard not to recall a story from 2012, so you will indulge me as I share the story about an excited, fairly young academic organizing one of her first conferences and collaborative projects. In the late autumn of 2012, the UCT academic offered to collect her Swedish colleague from the airport and drop her off at the guest house in Newlands. The academic was hosting a small conference and a series of meetings with her colleagues from Sweden, Canada, and the UK. Having lived in Cape Town for pretty much her whole life, she tended to stay away from the leafy suburbs close to the mountain. When she thought about this deeply, at the time she thought about this deeply, she theorized that this was probably because of her father's traumatic memories of forced removal. But she also knew that it was because of the racism she felt in those spaces. These thoughts and memories were the last thing on her mind as she collected her colleague and happily caught up with her on the drive from the airport to Newlands. Upon arrival at the exclusive guest house in the very leafy suburb, the white woman owner came out of the building to effusively welcome the Swedish professor. In that very moment, making it obvious that she thought that the South African academic, racialized as she was just the shuttle driver. A few awkward interactions followed, especially as the Swedish colleague quickly realized what was happening and tried to repair the situation by introducing the academic to the woman as Dr. Boonzaier from UCT. This kind of experience would be familiar and would recur in different ways, both inside and outside of UCT over the future years of her career. However, here I am, in celebration of this occasion, talking decolonial love, hope, and joy. For us, the practice of decolonial feminist psychology has centered radical hope, love, and healing, a methodology of decolonial love, a commitment to creating alternatives to the present. Our collective work and community building activities have been an illustration of what decolonial feminism can look like, showing how it is emergent, how it is lived, how it is felt, alongside everything we have written about decolonial feminism in and outside of psychology. Our practice has also called attention to the following questions. How do we humanize ourselves and others in the work we are doing? How do we show our care for ourselves and for our work? How do we open up space for intuition, creativity, embodiment? How are we impacted by the work that we do? And how does this shape our work? How do we allow space in our work for surprises, for unanticipated findings, for multiple voices and multiple knowledge? How do we hold space for the complexity of people's lives and realities, as well as the complexity of ourselves and our own histories and relationalities? Importantly, how do we open up space for healing, resistance, pleasure, love, and joy? Joy in 5 parts.
I'll share the joke after the lecture. Importantly, Bell Hooks has argued that work that enhances our spiritual well-being strengthens our capacity to love. How do we ensure that the work we do enhances our spiritual well-being in order to enhance our capacity for love? Decolonial love has been described as active resistance, recognizing our interconnectedness as an act of working together to dismantle all forms of subordination. Decolonial joy as a collective feeling that stems from the shared suffering and pain of coloniality, of transforming these experiences into spaces of community renewal and political disruption, about building joyful, equitable spaces. It is a specific form of joy that arises when individuals and communities feel the possibility of a different present, one where neither colonialism nor coloniality rules over their lives. So how do we create loving and joyful working environments for ourselves and others? How do we work with love in the interest of dismantling coloniality and renewing our spirits? How do we think about working with ideas of love, pleasure, joy, at the same time that we might be working with questions of violence, of coloniality, and of trauma? We think we are able to offer numerous examples from the work that we've been engaged in over the past while, the collective retreat being just one example. And we look forward to more collective decolonial joy, healing, fun, love, laughter, book clubbing, knitting, karaoke, and so much more. As I inch a bit closer to the end, I want to pause on this definition of decolonization offered by Maldonado Torres and colleagues that captures some of the movement towards hope, healing, and transformation that I've attempted to engage today. Decolonization means not only to undo colonization, but also to build the world of you in the very process of coming together to change the world. Acting, thinking, creating, and healing for self and collective transformation. The task of building the world anew, we know, is not an individual one. It is collective. So all that is left for me to do is to thank the many people who have been an important part of my journey. There are many. Some whom I may not remember to name here, but who I've held in my heart over the years. To all of my colleagues and collaborators over the years. From Cheryl Delaray, my first supervisor and mentor, who offered a model of what a feminist psychologist could look like, and who created space for me to imagine a future in psychology. Thanks to my past and present colleagues in my department, who have mostly left me to my own devices. My gratitude also to my colleagues across the university, especially those in the Black Academic Caucus, present company included. To my dear friend and comrade Shote, for the ways in which you've modeled transformational, collective forms of community building, for your friendship and love. To Mandisa, for the coffee, donuts, and the soup, and the many needed chats. To Ines for our long-standing friendship, and for keeping me committed to creativity and fun. To Tammy Sheffer and Peace Kiguwa, for the collaborative work on our very first book on gender in psychology, and for continued work and collaboration. Tammy, you've also been so generous in your support of me and my work over the years. Thank you for introducing me also to the sauna. And Tammy, I also need to say thank you for the very important role you've played in supporting countless Black women and feminists over many years. We see you and we love you. To David Gadd, Jeff and Margarita Hidian, for all of the support you've provided me in my career over the years. Kopano Ratele and Tammy for the lunch dates and the friendship. and the many serious selfies, which I won't share here. Thanks to Skip Dates for the support you've provided me in my career over the years, and support through the fellowships to the Du Bois Institute at Harvard. I'm also grateful to all of the colleagues far and wide that I've collaborated with over the years. Gratitude to my colleagues at UNISA's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, especially Shanaz Sufla for the continued inspiration from the decolonial work you continue to do. And to my colleagues at CISA for the tireless work around transforming psychology and welcoming me into the community of Black psychologists in the country. That include many, I won't mention names, but this has enabled me to find my space in this discipline. To all of the organizations that have supported our work over the years, FAMSA, NICRO, Triangle Project, Gender Dynamics, SWEAT, and especially to Mosaic in the House, for the tireless work you do, and for the investment in our long-term collaboration. I'm also grateful to my high school comrades involved in the Beacon Hill High alumni for offering a most beautiful model of what it looks like to lift as you rise and to always remember where you come from. I can't begin to describe the inspiration I've gained from all of my students that I've worked with over the years, and I won't be able to name all of them, although I did want to. A special mention must go out to Taryn van Niekerk, whose development in the discipline has been so closely knitted to my own. Taryn offered me a model of what a student collaborator could look like, not after, but during the process of supervision. All of my students hold a very special place in my heart. I'm especially grateful to all of you who have been collaborating to build our worlds, our own worlds, through the Hub. I'm grateful for the ways in which you hold each other and for the ways in which you have all been holding me. A special mention must go out to Haile Matutu, who was responsible for creating the beautiful home that we all occupy in the space of the Hub. I'm grateful to my extended family, to my aunties, my uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, for the role you played in my life from day one, always there supporting me and loving. To my grandparents and parents for holding us as best you could while also attempting to hold yourselves. I'm grateful for the love of my siblings, Natalie, Jeremy, Stacy, Ryan, my nieces and nephews. And the love of children. I'm grateful to my sons, Liam and Luke Daniels, for providing me the opportunity for feminist mothering. To Luke, for your love, care and empathy, coupled with your driest sense of humor that I really love. And to Liam for the liquor food that keeps me wanting more. And for the ways in which you always find the most complex language to ask the simplest of questions. That always makes me smile. I love you. Finally, thank you to my partner, who happens to be a husband. That's a private joke. Sean, thank you for sticking with me through the highs and lows and all of the crazy. I'm grateful to have had you with me on this journey. I've been advised by those who love me to effusively apologize to those I've not mentioned to name, which I do now. I've also been advised by those who love me not to end this lecture with a karaoke song. So unfortunately for all of you, this is very fair.
So much resonance and so much to reflect on. And of course we note the punctuation at the beginning from a young one to your delivery of your lecture. And we can only blame the acoustics in the building, because children must be children.
That's right.
We now invite to the podium Professor Tamara Shepherd to give the vote of thanks.
Gosh, I'm not often speechless. You know, as academics, we speak. That was such a beautiful lecture and so heartfelt. And Floretta is such a modest person who really doesn't, she's so humble, she's so gracious, she's so full of empathy and care. It's so wonderful to see all her scholarship, this incredible story that she told tonight, and to realize the gravitas of her scholarship. Not only her scholarship, but her friendship and her parenting and her partnerhood and everything. She lives what she lives. We said, you know, people must walk the talk. Very few of us academics manage to do that, and Floretta has illustrated here so magnificently this evening how beautifully she does that, and what a role model it is for all of us at so many different levels. So, I'm very bad at protocol, but I'm going to try also. DVC Ramahondo, Dean Casey, Professor Floretta Boonzaier, friends, family, and colleagues who are also friends very often, and family. It's really congratulations, Prof Boonzaier, and many thanks for this very, very engaging, very insightful, and also, as I've said, very heartfelt lecture and heartwarming. I think we're all feeling not only intellectually inspired, but moved in our bodies. And this is actually what we're writing about in terms of decolonizing the university, decolonizing society. So it's a special honor for me to be allowed to say a few words at this auspicious occasion of the inaugural lecture of a dear colleague, comrade, and friend. I count myself as extremely fortunate to have been a part of Floretta's research journey for many years now, as was evident. We've researched together, we've run projects together, we've edited books together, we've traveled together, not to mention gone shopping for shoes together and spent lots of time in the sauna together, as Floretta mentioned. Perhaps one of those lesser-known passions of Prof Boonzaier, but I think becoming increasingly evident with the development of a home sauna as well, which we all go to. I shouldn't have said that, sorry, Floretta. I first became familiar with Floretta's scholarship at an early point in both our careers, although, of course, I think I was quite a few years chronologically ahead. When she was a postgraduate student working, as she mentioned, with Cheryl Delaray, a former manager at this university and a lead feminist psychology scholar at the time. Also a role model, as Floretta mentioned. Floretta contributed a chapter to a book we were co-editing at the time. I think it was called Contemporary Issues in Human Development, something like that. It didn't actually feature. That was a forgotten part of early career. It was clear to everybody already that Floretta was a rising academic star. And Floretta has always been and continues to be an outstanding scholar, as we have seen, and an outstanding person on all levels. She consistently proves herself to be committed to excellence and rigor, as well as social justice and political sensitivity. And I think that was very clear in the story that she told of her research journey. But always also engaging a constructive, perceptive, and valuable collegiality in any forum. And of course, a dedicated supervisor and mentor. And I think that comes out so clearly in the work, the life work of Floretta Boonzaier. So I want to touch on just a few areas of many that speak to Floretta's intellectual and social justice contributions that she has also sketched so well in this beautiful story she has told about her research this evening. And it almost feels like unnecessary but why not yet again go over the incredible contributions that Floretta has made. Firstly, Floretta is undoubtedly a lead feminist psychologist in South Africa today, with solid international standing. Most importantly, is evident in the work of the Hub, and I think you saw a lot of that this evening. She has been extremely active and dedicated to generating a different kind of psychology, a feminist decolonial psychology that has not only shifted the terrain of psychology as a discipline and practice, but has also contributed to the larger project of decolonizing psychology globally, so not only in South Africa, but also globally. And we see this in a lot of the handbooks she's contributed to internationally, that bring a South African perspective, but actually a global argument that is not being made well enough in those spaces. Further, and this speaks to a second important emphasis in Floretta's scholarship that I think we could see in those incredible images of Montfleur that I wish to flag. Floretta has played a significant role in experimenting with and generating alternative forms of knowledge production, both research methodologies and pedagogies. Her research has consistently engaged and promoted feminist, qualitative, reflexive, decolonial methodologies, including a lot of art, arts-based, photo voice, photo narrative, and other creative, embodied, affective, and participatory research and pedagogical praxis. Her local and international publications on feminist narrative and photo narrative research, and her provocations for theorizing power and reflexivity in research and in psychological practice have served to disrupt normative traditions of extractivist and representational research, bolstering the decolonial imperative to radically reconceptualize the scholarship that we do and how we do it and what we do together in that space. Of course, Floretta's life work has been strongly dedicated to researching the challenges of IPV, interpersonal violence, sexual violence, and all forms of gender-based violence. And I think Shose said that very clearly at the beginning, that she is probably the leading scholar of sexual violence, IPV in South Africa, and certainly globally. In this respect, Floretta has generated a large body of work, and she showed it to us so well on the screen. As I said, there are some missing, quite a lot of missing pieces that you didn't see. So imagine that as snapshots of a very large corpus of work. She has generated this large body of work that has taken it into new directions, characterized by an astute and incisive intersectional feminist lens, and a consistent and sophisticated analysis and critique of deterministic perspectives on gender, not only on gendered violence, but also on gender. The scholarship opens up a more complex reading of GBV, challenging the essentialist and binary social and clinical representations of male perpetrators and female victims. Importantly, in taking forward this intersectional feminist lens, her scholarship has promoted an appreciation of the nuances and complexities of gendered subjectivities and violence is entangled with all forms of inequality. Floretta's work in this respect has not only advanced theoretical work on gendered violence, but has also been directed at practice and policy, contributing to policy documents and offering practice-based recommendations for counseling and other interventions directed to both male perpetrators and female victim survivors, whichever terminology you'd like to, they're all problematic. Thus, her research addresses both prevention and intervention, indeed troubling that divide, and facilitating novel ways of thinking about practice and policy in relation to theoretical and empirical knowledge. Importantly, Floretta has long played a role in what Spivak, and I'd like to quote her, I did this just the other day, some people might remember, what Spivak calls the other question, asking the other question. That is, prompting us to think differently and beyond the normative, and and her recent work on how Black women victims of violence are represented, such as her cutting-edge analysis of the public media responses to femicides, the brutal rape and murder of Anita Boyson that Floretta pointed out earlier, what she calls looking at the stories that we tell, has shifted and extended understandings of the politics of media representation and larger public imaginaries around sexual and gender violence, which of course then shape a whole lot of other spaces like the university, which Floretta's research has looked at. And so much of her work over the last few decades has contributed to calling out the problematic colonial gaze of both researchers and the public in general on women victims of male violence, particularly as directed at Black women through the hypervisibility of their bodies and the subsequent erasure of their subjectivities, but also as directed at Black men, represented as always already perpetrators of violence. And finally, I want to acknowledge a contribution of Floretta's work that is perhaps less visible, less acknowledged in our neoliberal university. And that is Floretta's commitment not only to outputs, and you can see there are a hell of a lot of those, but also, and importantly, to process. That is indeed a feminist and ethics of care principle that she models. But it is sadly relatively rare in the cutthroat academy we are currently living in. In this respect, she has always been highly committed to supporting and mentoring early career scholars, and I've always been so in awe of the cohort of excellent young researchers that Floretta gathers around herself, who develop their scholarship within her larger scholarly area and are supported at multiple levels, financially, through caring academic mentorship, through workshops at Montclair. And her record as a supervisor who not only facilitates successful and rapid graduation, but more importantly, facilitates scholarly development and a sense of agency and a sense of being empowered to make a difference. In this respect, her contribution to the transformation of the South African Academy, not to mention impacting on South African and global Southern representation, is hugely significant. Relatedly, for some time now, and we saw this at the end of Floretta's presentation tonight, I've been noticing a strengthening narrative around healing emerging in her scholarship and praxis. After all, psychology is supposed to be a healing profession, though many of us critical psychologists like Floretta have called it out for its violences. Quite recently, Floretta and colleagues have asked, and I'm citing, can a psychology that continues to discipline and reproduce essentializing and stigmatizing tropes, especially of those already marginalized, ever produce knowledge that affirms the humanity of those it theorizes? And here I see her thinking circling back from the critique of the band-aid healing of middle-class individualized therapy and the multiple violences of apartheid and mainstream psychology to thinking, writing, and promoting renewed and revitalized decolonial forms of healing, which I believe Floretta has anyways long offered in the nurturance and care she has shown the scholars and students she works with. This is the healing of care, of joy, of love, of playfulness, of fun, and perhaps a little karaoke thrown in too, but don't let me tell you my story of karaoke. I've got it off. As Floretta put it, it's a healing of hope, love, and joy. So to end, once again, thank you, Prof. Not only for the brilliant lecture today, your productive and so valuable voice, a body of scholarship, including the ones we know you're still incubating and we're looking forward to reading, but also an appreciation for the specialness of your approach to everything you do, the love, the nurturance, the care, and the joy that you bring to engagements, whilst also not ignoring the histories and ongoing pain and trauma that shapes every moment we live, in the academy and outside. And perhaps this is the decolonial joy that Frances Negron Moutonnier writes about as well as Floretta does. She describes it as joy that appeared at the precise moment when many of us felt the possibility of a different future, one where neither colonialism nor coloniality ruled over our lives. And Floretta beautifully models and inspires this practice of decolonial joy in the academy and elsewhere. Many, many thanks and many congratulations again, Floretta.
Thank you, Professor Schaefer, for those words of thanks and gratitude and congratulations. Well deserved. We've reached the end of our evening, well, the main part. You are now all invited to join us at the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa, and that's in the Department of Psychology in the PDHAN building. But if you could indulge us and rise to allow the platform to thank you.